I'm the music buyer here at Politics and Prose, and besides books, journals, and cards, we do sell CDs, and I can send you some vinyl too if you'd like. Tonight we welcome back Peter Guralnick and Rosanne Cash to talk about Peter's new book, Looking to Get Lost, Adventures in Music and Writing. They've both been with us before, and we welcome them back virtually in these strange times. It's a little cumbersome, but on the plus side, we can have these long distance conversations and you can join us from all over the country. So thanks for tuning in. We have a lot of events at our website, sometimes 2-3 a day. You can go to politics-prose.com/events. Peter and Rosanne will chat for a while, and at some point you'll be able to type in your questions, and there'll be a link at the bottom of the screen, and you can join the conversation. And most importantly, we would very much like you to buy Peter's book. and you do that by also clicking on the Q&A. You click on the link in the chat room, and you can order Peter's book through our store. If you live in the DC area, just come on by. We're open 9 a.m. to 8 p.m. Masks required. But we encourage you to come by. I wanted to just, again, thank everybody for joining us tonight. Peter, as you know, has written some great biographies on Elvis Presley, the 2-volume set, Sam Cooke, Sam Phillips, and many collections about blues, country, soul, and R&B. Just wanted to hold up. He also put out this great CD compilation that he picked, the great music from Sun Records, and wrote some great notes for it. Highly recommend that as well. Looking to Get Lost is just a thrilling book. There's just so many great profiles in them, and you'll get to hear Rosanne and Peter talk about it. Wanted to also mention that both Peter and Rosanne will have articles in the fall issue of Oxford American. It's the music issue. It's the annual music issue. Rosanne's article is on Sister Rosetta Tharpe, and Peter's article is on Skip James. So look forward to that. Just wanted to mention a couple of recent projects that Rosanne has done. She just released a new song called Crawling in the Promised Land on her website. And there's a wonderful and powerful letter that she wrote about it and about our current situation. It's handwritten. And I urge you to read it. She hosted a concert in June at Carnegie Hall entitled Present Perfect, Songs of Protest and Memory. You can watch that concert. And she just did an article for the Atlantic about touring, having to stop touring, the very conflicted feelings she had in the many years of touring. And 2 years ago, she released this album. She remembers everything. I highly recommend that as well. 30 more seconds. There's so many great anecdotes in this book, and I just wanted to just throw out a couple. Johnny Cash seeing Eleanor Roosevelt for the opening of the Dyess, Arkansas Library. Socialism in action, as Peter writes. I love that image. I found out that Jerry Lee Lewis played Iago in a rock and roll version of Othello. I found that in the back matter. And I love Solomon Burke's description of growing up in his grandmother's house church, where he said, I was born with trombones and tubas playing. If you could play an instrument or sing, you became a messenger for the heavens. So with that fanfare, I'd like you to welcome and help me welcome Peter Guralnick and Rosanne Cash. Over to you.
Thanks.
Hello. Hi, Peter.
Hi, Rosanne.
I'm in the opposite chair that I'm usually in. So I have so much swirling around in my head I want to ask you about. This book, Looking to Get Lost, is just like a deep dive into this rich texture. I mean, I know that saying about writing about music is like dancing to architecture, but not with you. This deep dive into the visceral experience of music is something really, really rare. Most music critics don't do that as well as you. And you said so many things in your book that I wrote down and I thought a lot about. One thing was about not writing about just the music, but about the life in back of the music, the person, their history, you know, the tangible aspects of who they are that feeds into the music they make. That was really moving to me. And also you said this great thing. You said, you must never think you are better than anyone else. And that you learned that from your father, who was an esteemed oral surgeon.
Mm-hmm.
And your grandfather, who was a pediatrician, right?
Right.
And that they didn't come at their patients with this sense of self-aggrandizement, but that with respect. And that is so evident throughout all your work, the respect. And I'm going to read this one quote that goes along with that. And then I would love for you to talk about this, how you've integrated this into your writing and into your own life. In your father's office, you said you had there was a sense of reassuring orderliness. The orderliness was at the service of the patient. It was intended to set the patient at ease. And there was an unfailing sense of courtesy and unwavering, I wrote something down wrong, that the patient, not the doctor's dignity or self-importance, was the focus. And that's exactly you do every time you talk to a musician. So you just took that right into your own work, clearly. Well, I mean, how does a nice boy from Boston, from a family of doctors, know how to write so astutely and passionately about the blues?
Well, it was also, you know, my grandfather was a socialist. He was an elector for Norman Thomas. It was just a sense of equality and fairness and justice. But, you know, this is something that to some degree I discovered in writing the book. You don't go into things and say, this is what I am in theory, just as you don't want to write a story about somebody and say, this is my preconception on this person, and the thing I'm going to write about them is going to bear out my preconception. I mean, everything is a voyage of discovery, and to some extent, it took me a long time to recognize how much the lessons that I learned from my father and grandfather, not all of which I embraced. I'm sure you can recognize this. I didn't embrace every one of them 100% at every moment, but how much of these had combined to shape what I did. And I guess that I never wavered. I mean, from the moment that I first started talking to people, the very first person I spoke to was Henry Green, the British novelist. And I forced myself out of a catalytic state, or out of a catatonic state, I'm sorry, not catalytic at all, you know, to speak to him, because his work, I was 19 years old, and his work meant so much to me. And I did this, it was the same with Skip James, who is in the issue of the Oxford American that your story is on the cover, but about Sister Rosetta Tharpe. But again, I articulated to myself, greatness such as this will not pass my way again. And I don't know where the quote comes from. It's somewhere obvious, but I can't remember. But my whole intention was to tell the world, you know, how important these people's contributions were and how important they were themselves. So, I mean, I started out sort of with the idea of being at the service of the people I was writing about. And it was only later that I could connect it. And I think it means something. It means a great deal to me now, but that I could connect it with the way in which my father and my grandfather approached medicine, with a sense, again, of always recognizing the dignity of the people they were dealing with, of never calculating that dignity as being the product of either education or background or wealth or, but it was just human dignity. And that was what I tried to convey.
Well, that's one part of it. But the other part is that you spoke particularly about your grandfather, that he had an unwavering, unconditional support of you, acceptance, whatever you wanted to be or do. And that everywhere you went as a child, people expected you to be a doctor. But your family, your father said something like, you have to be who you are and follow your instincts no matter what. And you got that from your grandfather too.
From both grandfathers, yeah.
Both grandfathers. So could they have ever imagined that you would take this course? And was there some kind of lightning bolt moment where you went, this is it? I'm going to write about these obscure blues musicians, and that will lead me to Merle Haggard and Tammy Wynette, and that will lead me, down a path that 55 years later, you have a compendium of essays.
No, there was never that moment, because I wanted to be a writer. There was no thought of writing about music because there was no place to write about music in. And I started off writing, my other grandfather, not my father's, my mother's father, was an English teacher. And he was just so passionate about literature and so passionate about plays and Eugene O'Neill and George Bernard Shaw, but also he was such a fan of me. I felt like, I'm like Elvis. I was loved, and it was a wonderful privilege, but I also, we had good fights too. But the thing was, I was committed to being a writer, and that's what I wanted to do. And I wrote short stories and I wrote novels, and I still do. But when the opportunity came along, I fell into the blues right around the same time that I read the Hemingway interview in the Paris Review, where he spoke about working methods and spoke about his commitment to work, his work ethic. Didn't matter what else he had done, what he did the night before, what he was planning to do the following day. He was always going to write his 500 words or 600 words or 400 words. And I committed myself to that when I was 15. And then when the opportunity came along to tell people at the same time, when I was 15 or 16, I just kind of fell into the blues. Now, I can't explain it. I've said this over and over again. It just struck a chord with me. I had never heard anything like it before. It's what I return to again and again and again. The blues, Sister Rosetta Tharpe. I'll never get away from it. And so when the opportunity came along to write about some of these things, friends of mine, anybody who knew me, knew that I was a maniac for the blues, and I would tell them I was just proselytizing all the time. And a couple of people got in a position where they were working for the Boston Phoenix. This other kid I knew started Crawdaddy, which was, billed itself as the first rock and roll magazine. And they said, well, would you like to write about the music? And I said, yeah, I want to write about Muddy Waters, Howlin' Wolf, Bo Diddley, Chuck Berry, Jerry Lee Lewis, and Crawdaddy was sort of about psychedelic rock in a sense. Not exclusively, but primarily. And so I'm writing about Robert Pete Williams, this very strikingly original, but not primitive at all, but rural, let's say, blues singer. Or I'm writing about Buddy Guy, who was not that well known at the time. And this is in the middle of Moby Grape and the Grateful Dead and the Jefferson Airplane. But they accepted that. They said, okay, fine, if that's what you want to do. And that's how I started out doing it. And I just was trying to bring people to the music. That's really all I wanted to do.
Was Peter Nobler at Crawdaddy when you were writing then?
I know the name Peter Nobler, but I never met him.
Oh, he's my son-in-law's father. So he kind of started same era with you, and he was at Crawdaddy. There's something you said that really struck me too, about you were proselytizing about this music to people you knew, but you're not really a proselytizer. You just convey passion. You don't try to school people. And that you said something in the book too about being of service, that you thought it was a service to make people aware of this music, to educate them about it because of this cultural wellspring and this, American vernacular needed to be known, that it was part of our collective unconscious, part of being American.
Right, but also this cultural bias, this majoritarian bias against all. I mean, the idea of writing about Muddy Waters was so. I mean, I'm not trying to boast about anything. Lots of people were recognizing Muddy Waters at the time, but the point was there was no majoritarian impulse towards recognizing anything from these kinds of origins, whether it was African American or it was poor white or hillbilly or whatever you want to call it. These things were just beneath, they were beneath notice, let alone contempt. So, I mean, to write and to champion these was, for me, was a significant act of some kind.
Well, champion being a really important word, because it wasn't like you were just looking at them like a sideshow or a museum piece, but you were actually conveying the reality and the depth and the richness of that music. I mean, I've often felt that if we don't know that music, we don't know ourselves as Americans, because it's so much a part of who we are. And Mississippi Delta in particular, it's like you have William Faulkner next to Howlin' Wolf, next to B.B. King, next to Eudora Welty, next to Robert Johnson. Like, if we don't know that, then we don't really know ourselves.
Well, just as if we deny the immigrant experience, we're denying the history of our country. I mean, it's what Johnny Shines, the great blues singer Johnny Shines, said. These are the pillars of the peers. And, he spoke so eloquently, Johnny Shines. I mean, he was such a dedicated reader himself. He taught himself how to read, and he was a dedicated reader, but he articulated that sense of the history. I invited Johnny Shines up to the camp that I ran. My grandfather had started a boys' camp, and when he became ill, I took it over and ran it for 22 years. And I invited Johnny Shines to come up and sing. And I don't know that he ever did another gig like that in his life, but he appeared in front of these kids who really had no exposure to blues. And he gave this history, cultural lesson. I mean, this, while also singing these, with great power and great impact, all these songs. It was one of the scariest things I've ever done, because it's like introducing somebody you just care about so much to other people that you care about a great deal, and just hoping they're going to hit it off. And he was, he was a great hit, but he was not an outgoing guy. So, I mean, I didn't know how it was going to work out.
And how did the kids respond to him?
Oh, they responded. They responded totally.
Yeah.
I mean, in some ways, they responded better than some of the audiences that he was singing to at blues festivals and at folk clubs, where he had an introspective manner. He was an outgoing singer, but he had an introspective manner. But I'll tell you, I also brought Sleepy LaBeef up there, who was just a totally outgoing performer. And he just drove the kids crazy. So but the Johnny Shines thing, I mean, it was just an example of without any self-consciousness, without being didactic or anything about it. It was contextualizing the blues and the African-American experience, part of the African-American experience, within the framework of the culture in which it had been so scorned.
Well, you said this, you had this great line about reflecting the music, not just dissecting it, and that the music expressed for you a, quote, sharp release and savage joy. I had to read that 5 times. That just killed me, Peter. I mean, I need to put that in a song. Do you mind?
No, it's yours.
Release and savage joy. I mean, there's also a humility in approaching these musicians, isn't there? Because there's so much suffering. The threads of suffering go back and back and back and back to the slave experience. And I had this experience once myself where I played at Dockery Farms in Mississippi, where Howlin' Wolf and Charlie Patton, worked in the cotton fields. And I have a friend whose grandfather was Joe Dockery, and they wanted to bring music back to Dockery Farms again, because those musicians would play on the, on the porch after picking cotton all day. And at the after party, I'll just tell you this brief story. At the after party, after I played a concert, there was this 90-year-old blues harp musician, Cadillac John Noten, and he played at the after party. And nobody was paying attention to him except me and the band, who kept looking over, trying to glance at people and looking over at Cadillac John. And I went over to him at the end of the evening and thanked him. And he said, oh, when I was behind the plow in the cotton fields as a young man, he said, there was a radio on the porch. He said, every time your daddy came on the radio, we would run out of the fields and stand around it. And I started weeping. It was like my grandfather, my racist grandfather, was across the river plowing a cotton field.
Yeah.
And this man doing the same, running to hear my dad. And then here I am decades later with him at this after party of me playing a concert. It was so humbling. And I felt like, I get all the attention, but the source of the source is in him and those people. And the respect you bring to those musicians it's heartening, and it's also humbling.
Well, you spoke about not proselytizing, and in some way, I think you're right. I mean, what I've always tried to do is to describe as, eloquently as I'm capable of, and as precisely as I'm capable of, the world in which each of the people I'm writing about lives, who they have learned from, who they are, but beyond that, to get beyond the surface. I mean, that was the reason why I asked your father about his reading as a kid. That's what led to the Eleanor Roosevelt story. And it wasn't, what it was you could go on forever about the Tennessee 2 and the Tennessee 3 but I just felt like, okay, I know he's a reader. He was a reader up until the day he died. And as I got to know him a little over the years, he was always reading. I mean, it was something.
Yeah, he was.
But, so I asked him about that, and he starts talking about James Fenimore Cooper and Sir Walter Scott and Ivanhoe and Drums. I think Drums Along the Mohawk was a book that he mentioned. And that was what led him to talking about Eleanor Roosevelt when she came to Dyess to dedicate the library, which was probably a Carnegie library, I'm sure. And he spoke with such pride about it. And, that he thought it was the biggest library in the state, which I don't know if it was or it wasn't, but it was in a rural community. But he, and then I said, well, all right, so, were there many kids you knew who would take advantage of the library like that, who read all these books? And he was, again, I'm not trying to hold this up as the ultimate, but, he was saying, he was not boasting about anything, but he just looked at me, he says, no, I don't know anybody else who did. They read school books, but he was, and it just said something about him. It said something about him beyond the public persona. And that was why, in that particular instance, I talked to him about that.
Well, I'm glad you picked up on that and wrote about it, because that is a very important end to him that maybe nobody else would have known or thought of to even ask. And his entire life on the road, the first thing he would do when he got to a town was to find the old bookstore. He loved antique bookstores in particular.
Right.
A lot of antique books. But he told that story about Eleanor Roosevelt his whole life. He was so proud because she shook the hand of every child in that community. And he said he never forgot shaking Eleanor Roosevelt's hand. So
yeah,
sweet.
yeah, and the way he described Dyess too as a socialist experiment, is this or that? Yeah, and so
saved our lives.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So but it led to. I mean, the point was, I didn't think my story was going to be about, about his reading or about the library, but it gave an insight, and it gave the conversation a whole different kind of a thing. But you meet so many different people. I mean, you meet somebody like Merle Haggard, who in many ways it was the opposite of your father in terms of his public persona. I mean, he was one of the glummest people I've ever met in terms of public persona. Although I've also saw him relax and open up in ways that were just wonderful.
Yeah.
But it's kind of like, okay, Merle Haggard doesn't owe me anything. I'm here at his sufferance, and I have no basis. I'm not going to get upset I'm not going to get upset about anything, because this is his show.
Right.
And so it was like one of the interviews I did with him, I think I asked him, I may get this wrong, but I asked him, this is how it started out. It was a great start. Did anybody influence you as a songwriter? And he paused for a long 20 or 30 seconds, and he said, nope. And, now you could think that was discouraging, but I figured, okay, well, let's see if we can get somewhere else. And what was interesting was, by the time we got to something, he spoke so eloquently and with such feeling about the roots, not of his experience, but of what he was trying to express in song. Or I'll tell you another thing that totally surprised me was in talking to Bill Monroe, and it was in this diner mostly. It was in his office, which I think was in a trailer, or, it was not a building. But mostly in this diner. And I was talking to him about what gave him the inspiration for the songs he wrote. And maybe he told this to everybody, but he started talking about an instrumental he had written called Land of Lincoln. And he talked about all the things he imagined. It was about Lincoln, I think, as a young lawyer, and how he imagined, this young lawyer walking on the street and all the people around him, and this and that. Something I wouldn't have gotten in a million years. And like I say, this could have been just a rote response on his part, but for me, it was such an insight into the depths of his songwriting and how much the songs meant for him. And there are lots of other things you could have written about, that you could write about. And if you want to, if you're a certain kind of person and you have come into the world wanting to show other people up, you could show me up for what I'm saying now. That's an easy thing to do. But what was so interesting to me with Bill Monroe was the pride that he took both in his songwriting and in what a hardworking man he was. And he started going on about how he had grown up that way. And those were things that gave insight, not necessarily that on such and such a date in such and such a studio he had recorded this song or that song. That was my responsibility to know that. And if I wanted to use it, I could use it. But what I wanted to find out was who was Bill Monroe?
Who was he? Well, that's why your writing is so good, Peter, because you have the mind of an artist, in that when somebody gives you something like that, instead of going back to your pre-programmed ideas about what you're going to write and who that person is, that you follow the thread, and it ends up being about something completely different, or like my dad and his love of reading, and Eleanor Roosevelt, some take on it that is so peculiar and specific and beautifully pristine. I love that about your writing so much. There's about Merle Haggard, that scene you describe at soundcheck, where he goes on and on and on and on and on at soundcheck, and he brings up, who does he bring up in the show? And in the show, they go, that's not the way to bring him up, and he just says, to hell with you, I'm going to do it anyway.
Wasn't that the blind Jimmy Rogers interpreter or imitator? Was from Louisiana, I think.
Yes.
Who was I can't remember his name, but Merle was so taken with him. This was a guy, and I can't evaluate how good or he was. What I know was that every yodel was exactly the yodel that Jimmy Rogers used in that particular song it was just identical. And Merle is saying, this guy is a greater artist than I'll ever be. And I'm thinking, it's like, but wait a minute, you've created something altogether new, and this guy is really impressive. But Merle was so lifted up out of himself by this guy and by his dedication. And, he lost his sight in World War II, the Jimmy Rogers singer. But Merle would not, the audience is there and they want to hear, they want to hear Merle. And if they don't want to hear The Fight Inside of Me or Okie from Muskogee, they wanted to hear Mama Tried, let's say. And Merle is saying, no, wait a minute. Let's hear, Mr. Mississippi and You.
That was what fascinated me about it, is that Merle didn't give a damn what the audience wanted. I mean, he was kind of turning his back, and he gave the encore to the guy instead of taking it himself, or the end of the show or something. It was really, really fascinating. The other thing I wanted to ask you about that struck me too is that you have a way of presenting stories of real heartbreak in musicians. And the two I'm thinking of most right now are Skip James and Tammy Wynette. Both
Not the usual pairing.
no. And at some point I want to ask you how you got from Skip James to Tammy Wynette. But in different ways, the heartbreak is there. Skip James, because, well, just the native suffering, but also that he would be playing for a crowd of 20 people.
Yeah,
That he never made money, that he made $40 on an album, that he never achieved that kind of success that he thought he deserved, that he knew he deserved, and that he did deserve. And that Tammy Wynette, who did achieve this, this pinnacle, the greatest female country singer of her time, and lauded in every way possible, and still the suffering and the heartbreak at the center of that. And the way you present those stories, those two and others with, equal heartbreak, is so clear-eyed and respectful and non-sentimental. And that's something I really appreciate in your writing. And I just wanted you, I mean, that Skip James piece that you wrote, and that it's in the new, it was actually one of the first pieces you ever wrote, right? In 1965? Is that right?
Well, he was the first person that I ever interviewed
Interviewed.
outside Henry
Right.
Green. And then the
Right.
original iteration, which was quite different from the chapter in the book, was, that it was probably I think it was in Crawdaddy in 67, I believe. But that's not what's in the, that's not the chapter, but it's similar. It's from the same occasion.
Well, I read that piece, and it's going to be in the new Oxford American too. I read it a few times because it moved me so much. But right at the center of that piece, you talk about this book.
Mhm.
I can't remember the guy's name, who really denigrated the blues in general. And
It was Stephen Call. Yeah.
yeah. And that was an aside that at first I thought, well, why is he writing about that? Why is he taking away from it? But then I realized that you needed the, not contrast, but something to push off against, that it made your point even clearer. But can you talk a little bit about Skip James? Because he really, I'm fascinated by him.
Well, I think what was so extraordinary about him was, first of all, that before he was rediscovered in Mississippi in 65, in 64, his recordings, his very rare and very few recordings, exerted such a eerie and uncanny and overwhelming power, and influenced so many people in so many ways, including Robert Johnson, whose Hellhound on My Trail is an adaptation of the harmonic structure of Skip James's Devil Got My Woman. I mean, the two greatest songs of each of them, each of their greatest songs were linked. But then to have him rediscovered in a hospital in it's where the casino is now, outside of Memphis. But anyway, and he was rediscovered in the hospital, brought up to Newport, and there he is. He hasn't played in years, certainly not played publicly, and he gets up in front of a crowd and he recaptures this completely. And for Skip James, who was a very proud, highly, intelligent, really is a sort of a demeaning word. He just was a guy of great intelligence, perspicacity, and also a vocabulary that could sometimes contradict itself. I mean, it was a polysyllabic vocabulary, and you sometimes could get lost in the polysyllables. But he had vast ambition, and there was a confidence underneath that his artistry, and he considered it artistry, was going to be recognized by this group of young white kids who had pulled him out of a hospital to appear at the Newport Folk Festival. And it wasn't. I mean, he watched other musicians from that same era, Mississippi John Hurt, with whom he was friendly, achieve great popularity through the warmth of their personality and also through their music. And Skip didn't dismiss Mississippi John Hurt's music, but from his point of view, this was nowhere near. His music was music of vaulting ambition, and Mississippi John Hurt's was just little play songs, playthings. And I'm not saying that's the case, but that's what he thought. And he was. And
Hey, what do you think about that? Do you compare them in any way, or you have them?
I think Skip was a highly original, artist along lines that Mississippi John Hurt never conceived of for his music. Mississippi John Hurt was a songster who performed songs, some of which he wrote and some of which, many of which were the songs with which he had grown up or that he had heard all his life. And he presented them in the most charming way, but he was not looking to create an altogether strikingly original and individualistic kind of a thing. I mean, the blues is almost a common pool. And you have, even the greatest blues singers, like, let's say, Son House or Howlin' Wolf, are pulling lyrics not out of the air, but out of this common pool of verses and putting them together whereas somebody like Robert Johnson, and you can see the influences on Robert Johnson, and you can see the influences on Skip James to a lesser degree, but they're creating work which, from their point of view, is going to stay pretty much the same from performance to performance, because they conceive of it as a structured work, as something which they have created, not out of whole cloth, but they've created, and that's what it was meant to say. And that's unusual in the blues, I think, in at least in the traditional blues.
That performance at Newport, you weren't there, were you? Or were you?
Yeah.
You were there.
Yeah.
Wow.
That was.
There's a clip. After I read your piece, I went down a Skip James tunnel rabbit hole, and there's a video clip of him backstage. I think he was playing Hard Time Killing Floor Blues for Howlin' Wolf and Mississippi John Hurt. Is that right? Have you seen this?
Yeah. Although that was a couple of years later.
Oh, it was.
That was what Alan Lomax.
They weren't giving it up to him, were they?
No, not at all. He was a. He was they sometimes speak of, he was a stiff-necked man. That was he was proudly himself. He didn't move a lot. No, they weren't giving it up for him. Whereas
that made me sad. I felt bad for him when I was watching that clip. I mean, do you think he became embittered, or was he just kind of resigned and a bit heartbroken by it?
Well, he became very ill at the same time. He was diagnosed with cancer, and he died within, just a short period of time, a short number of years. So a lot of things went wrong at the same time. But I think he was, you have somebody, take somebody like Charlie Rich, who was one of the great artists.
Okay, I'll take him. Yeah.
One
of the great singers of all time.
Yeah. No, and I mean, and the, from the moment I met him, he was playing 6 sets a night out at the Vapors by the airport in Memphis. And there were 3 other, these were tea dances where businessmen, well, let's say men and women congregated, and it went on for a long time. And Charlie, that was where I first met him. But Charlie would never have, if Charlie had never achieved popular success, in some ways he would have been better off. I mean, from Charlie's point of view, I mean, he said this many times to me, he would have been happier if he could have just played the piano in the Hotel Peabody. There's a piano right there in the lobby, and he could have just sat there and people wouldn't have known who he was, and he could have just expressed himself the way he wanted to. I mean, he was agoraphobic, but I mean, he just really, so everything about success put him off, to the point where he threw it away at the CMA Awards.
Oh my God, I was in the audience that night. I was. I'll just briefly say this, and then it's time to go to question and answer. But I was young. I maybe in my teens when that happened. It's the legendary event where Charlie was presenting Entertainer of the Year, and he opened the envelope and he took out his lighter and set the envelope on, or
Right.
the name on fire, because it was John Denver who had won.
Yeah.
And the next day, all of the Carter women, June and Helen and Nita, I heard them talking about it, and one of them said, and I never heard those women say a curse word in their entire life. And one of them said, well, Charlie sure showed his ass last night.
But the funny thing is, I mean, when we're talking about success, this was his way out. And he agreed. I mean, I interviewed him not long after, and that was the last time I think I interviewed him. And then we continued to be friends until his death. But he thought about it and he said, I think that may be right. They were putting it out in a press release that he had been bitten by a snake.
Oh, wow.
It was either the snake venom or the antidote to the snake venom. And I don't know what it meant. I don't know that he didn't like John Denver, but whatever the case.
Oh, he was there. This was an alcohol fueled moment.
Well, there's no doubt about that, but much of Charlie's life was alcohol fueled, and it didn't always express itself in that way.
Yeah.
But it was he literally threw away, his success. And when we spoke, not really quite soon after that, he and his wife, Margaret Ann, who was just a wonderful songwriter, a very gifted songwriter, and
Sure.
who was his sort of his, there's always an inside person and an outside person. She was the outside person. But they just talked about the strains the success had put upon them both, upon their marriage, their relationship, all these things. And, they were saying to me, we're not asking anybody to feel sorry for her. I mean, they had different problems, but each of them she was a great reader too, Margaret Ann Rich. But they were saying, we're not asking anybody to feel sorry for us. We recognize that we are, privileged. We have this, but you don't know how hard it is. And I mean, I didn't want to write a sob story, and it wasn't a sob story, but it was the truth about how they felt. And that's the variation. And that's what, going back to what you said about Merle Haggard, he was in the middle at that time of a very volatile period in his life, which probably all the periods of his life were volatile in one way or another. But he had written that song Footlights, which is about what it means to be on stage and for people to expect things of you when you don't necessarily feel them, and how to have a fan come up to you and say, smile, Merle, and he would say, why? What's there to smile about? And he was saying, I want to give it all up. Now, he didn't give it up. He continued to write. I mean, Merle evolved in so many different ways and continued to be such a great songwriter and singer in so many different ways. But there is always that push and pull, and the Tammy Wynette, I thought, exemplified it as much as anybody.
Definitely. I mean, I've experienced some of that myself. You have to have a thick skin and an open heart to be a performer.
But you described, I just want to bring one thing, you described singing, when you and your father were having either
we were on the outs a little bit.
Yeah, right. And he wanted you to sing I think it was I Still Miss Someone on stage. And you described how that permitted you to come together in a way that nothing else could have, and how this is the power of music.
Well, that's true. And it was not just any stage, it was Carnegie Hall.
Right.
And I said no a couple of times and then did it. And like you said, the power of music to heal all things, the spotlight can be like a healing light. It's really amazing. All right, questions. There's actually, this is a really good question. Ed McGuigan, I think that's how you say it. Great conversation. Peter, I recently read that you sold your record collection, except 100 records. What were some of the records you held on to? That's a fascinating question.
Well, they were really, it's a very quirky, I just picked out things that Shirley Griffith and J.T. Adams on Prestige Bluesville. I mean, I always loved that music, and who knows why. Reverend Pearlie Brown on Folklore, a couple of Robert Pete Williams records, Aretha's I Never Loved a Man. I mean, obvious things like that, or, the best of Little Walter, the best of Muddy Waters with that great muddy face on the corner, on the cover. But it was just kind of like, the other day I was listening to Billy Joe Shaver, I mean, after his death, and what an incredible songwriter he was and performer. The only performer I've ever seen who bore a resemblance to Howlin' Wolf, not because they sounded anything like each other, but because whatever you got on stage on a particular night was which just came out of how they happened to be feeling on that particular night.
Yeah.
And but anyway, so I discovered to my surprise that one of the records I'd saved was Old Five and Dimers Like Me on Monument that Chris Christopherson had produced on his first album. And so anyway, so that's it was just totally arbitrary. And this friend of mine, Ross Colhonan, who bought the records, he and his partner Paul Baz, his business partner, but Ross said, "Peter, you sure you don't want to sell these? They're worth a lot of money and this and that." And I said, "No." And he said, "But what about this?" And I said, "No, for whatever reason, but it was pure instinct and feel, which is kind of the way I tried to put this book together."
That makes total sense to me. Aretha, Chris Christopherson, what you're doing is going to people who really, the essence of them is true greatness. I mean, that like the thread from Skip to Tammy, it makes sense to me. All right, Paul Hatchett says, can you talk about what a tragedy it has been that all of the great blues music was not known and enjoyed by the white citizens of that era until it was imported back through the British? How does that phenomenon strike you looking back now? I mean, I would have to disagree in part because of you, but because of what you've done so early, around the same time or earlier. But
well, again,
yeah,
not to make this totally circular, but look at your father. I mean, when he was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, a friend of mine wanted me to introduce him to your father. And I'm saying, you go introduce yourself. It's like, you don't need me. And so we went over to the table. I mean, I felt really embarrassed but we go to the table. Your father jumps up. He says, "I'll bet I was the first person in this room who heard Robert Johnson." Now that exemplifies two aspects of his personality. One is, I mean, I'm saying I'm mumbling on Peter Guralnick because I don't expect anybody to recognize me. But he immediately clicks on the fact I'd written Searching for Robert Johnson a couple of years earlier, two or 3 years earlier. He immediately clicks on that. But the other thing was, he described how when he signed with Columbia, Don Law had played him these Robert Johnson tapes before the album came out. So he was right. I mean, there might have been somebody in the room who had heard it before, but, and he took great, and he believed so strongly in the roots of America's music of every kind.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I don't take, I understand the question, and I
do too.
I understand how, when I first heard the Rolling Stones, I thought, oh my God, there's somebody out there who's actually listening to this music, who is making popular, enjoying popular success. And that was sort of thrilling for me. But there were people all the time who were listening, and I feel like you have to go back to everything that's ever been neglected. You may have a favorite author, you may have a favorite musician, you may have a favorite anything. I mean, look at how long did it take John Donne to be recognized? About 300 years.
Right.
How long did it take Herman Melville to be recognized? About the same length of time it took Robert Johnson. So I don't gauge popular success as being at all equivalent to artistic worth. It's not against artistic worth, but it doesn't define artistic worth. And I believe that the art will prevail. I mean, people will eventually come around to it if they don't come around to it immediately. But really, what the question begs, forget about the music. What we're talking about is the racial divide, which is as great today as it was 50 years ago or longer ago. And that's the terrible tragedy. I mean, we would all be open to everything, including polka music, if we didn't have all these prejudices.
That's a really good point. But I also understand the question, it's like Keith Richards taught us about Sister Rosetta Tharpe, taught some people about her. And, you know, nobody would have known Buck Owens until Ringo sang Act Naturally, you know.
Well, yeah, but that shows that it's not so much racial as it's caste or class.
Yes.
Or it's everything, and that's not in any way to diminish the racial aspect of it, but the class aspect is so great, and the continuing insistence on dividing people within the same class. I mean, think of, you know, I think in the 1890s you had this great populist movement, a word that has been demeaned in recent years, but I'd led, I think, by Tom Watson, and it was bringing poor whites and poor blacks together. This is in the 1890s, and it was basically upended by the plutocracy, who divided the blacks from the whites and taught them they should, you know, or you should taught the poor whites that they had nothing in common with the poor blacks and they should be looking down on them. And that's been the strategy all along of how people keep power.
Mm. You know, we could have a whole other conversation about race. I just did this thing for the Americana convention where I interviewed Alice Randall and Angela Davis, and we talked about jazz, and we talked about songs about lynchings and slave songs, and that kind of divide you're talking about. And it was so powerful and so moving. I mean, that is a whole other, not just evening, but lifetime to talk about it. There's two questions about Lonnie Mack, interestingly. Joe McEwen and William Lazarus are both asking about Lonnie Mack and what attracted you to write about him. And can you explain what about him enabled an unusual connection, white blues? That's what they're talking about.
Well, Lonnie Mack is just, you know, one of the most powerful singer performers, you know, in that blues and gospel tradition that I had ever heard. And that was what drew me to his music. I mean, he just was so strong, and to have, you know, to have this influence coming out of the Five Blind Boys in Mississippi. I mean, that was one of his greatest influences, out of Wilson Pickett in the Ohio. I forget which is first, not the Ohio Players, the Ohio Players, I think, Robert Ward, and this mixed black and white influence. I mean, there was a gospel singer who lived next door to him, I think a white one, and Ralph Trotto taught him guitar. All of these influences came together, and the amazing thing is, and again, I don't anticipate these consonances, or, you know, these things coming together, but as I was writing the Dick Curless chapter, here's Dick Curless growing up in Maine, and his story is virtually the same as Lonnie Mack's. Both of them going down to the hobo jungles, bringing the, you know, tramps food, listening to Jimmy Rogers, recognizing that this is where Jimmy Rogers, songs came from, where his music came from. But Lonnie Mack, I mean, man, he just played and sang with such searing power, and I would defy anyone to listen to Where There's a Will, or just a ton of his songs. It's riveting. But what was weird was to meet him at a time in his life when he was living in Nashville, which he just absolutely hated. He ended up living somewhere outside of it. You know, when he died, he was living in Smithville, maybe Smith something, outside of Nashville. But he hated being there. He felt like he was captive of some commercial, I don't know what, enterprise hegemony. And he was looking to take off, go to the Cascades, where I don't think he stayed. And he had a commercial album coming out, and but he had an old school bus in his backyard in Nashville. And I think he was planning to go to the Cascades and that. And I don't know if that's what he did or not. Didn't look like it would make it, but maybe it did. But every afternoon, he would go out there and play bluegrass. And because he no longer was moved by the music that I just described, he didn't want to play that music anymore.
Wow.
And he came from a tradition of bluegrass. He had uncles who played. He told me all about them. He said, if you heard them, you'd never listen to me again, or you'd never listen to, you know. And and what was strange, and again, it's unanticipatable, and I don't have any judgment of any, I mean, I want to describe what happens. I don't want to judge what happens. But he had the end of that week I spent with him, he had the album release party for his new album, and he sets it up and he drove everyone out of the room by the volume of his playing, and then he started crying at the end. And it was just like he didn't want to be the person he had been all along, the person that I had drawn me to him in the first place, everything that had drawn me to him. And he wanted to do something else that was not what the public was looking for from him. And that's what he ended up doing after everybody left. His friends sort of consoled him. A few had come down from Indiana, and a yo-yo champion that he had known from his childhood, or maybe not, but growing up. And then he played some of the music that he wanted to play after the entire audience had left. So, I mean, if I were writing this as fiction, I probably would not dare make it up. And I don't ascribe great significance to it, except it just describes
Right.
Lonnie Mack is, and this man of such great heart and great feeling.
That is so moving to me, that you reach this point where your authentic self, there's still a piece of it that's buried that has to come out, and you've been pleasing people for decades. And, at some point you have to say to hell with it. That's deeply moving. We only have time for one more question. And there were so many good questions. I'm sorry.
Roseanne, we can go a little longer.
Okay.
We're a little flexible if you're prepared, if you can stay on for a few more minutes. We
Okay.
a
So
little
we'll take a couple more questions, because this is so interesting to me. This is apparently from somebody Peter, Arthur Levine. Peter, how did you get so many Black performers over the years who had troubled experiences with whites to tell you the true stories of their lives? And thanks for praising my work on R&B for U.S. News in a letter I treasure. Very sweet.
I don't ascribe, anything to myself. I mean, in that sense, I mean, I think everybody has a story they want to tell. Everybody wants to tell their own story, and it's up to you to listen,
Right.
and maybe to be well enough informed to ask questions that which may draw out of them. It's like, again, and I don't want to keep coming back to this, but talking to your father, and I bring up reading, and that I didn't know what it would bring out, but it brought out something that meant something to him, that he felt deeply. But I in some ways, again, a lot of people have asked me, well, how did it, feel you spoke to so many Black performers? But I was no more removed from their experience. I mean, I was totally removed from it, but I was no less removed from the experience of Waylon Jennings or Merle Haggard. I mean, I didn't grow up in a world that, that mirrored their experience in any way, but it had nothing to do with my experience. It was simply, I wanted to put myself, what you said before, at the service of their experience. So I feel like occasionally people will say, well, how did you get this person to say this or that? I couldn't have gotten it because I didn't know what the story was. I mean, when people provide revelations of something, it's not something that I knew about. I wasn't prodding them to tell me something that I knew about. They felt, I mean, the funniest thing, it's not funny. I mean, it was just, when I was writing sweet soul music, and I was in Macon, and I spent quite a bit of time in Macon, and I was with this woman it's terrible, I've forgotten her name. She was Phil Walton's secretary at that point, a wonderful woman. And she dropped me off I was looking for Johnny Jenkins, who had been a band leader in the first band that Otis Redding had sung in. And he had sort of disappeared. Nobody really either knew or wanted to say where he was. And her mother lived in the same neighborhood as Johnny Jenkins, the woman who was the secretary of Phil Walton. She dropped me off in this yard and then drove off. I had no idea where I was. I mean, there was no such thing as Uber then. And it wasn't really the most prosperous neighborhood, but she dropped me off in the yard. And there's a guy underneath the car in the driveway. And he slides out from underneath the car. He's holding a wrench, and he starts advancing on me and just yelling, "What are you doing here, you white honky?" For this, And I'm thinking like, geez, what am I doing here?
What are you doing?
Where's my friend? Where's her mother live? But, so, I mean, what do you do? So this is a guy who was, in addition to having suffered, let's say, racial, uh, prejudice, he was also, at least all of his friends said so, he was disturbed. He was mentally disturbed. He was depressed, and he was suffering from, a certain amount of mental illness. But so I started talking to him, and I said, look, I'm here because I really admire, Otis Redding. I admire what you did with him. I mean, and gradually he put down the wrench, which I was relieved about. and then we went into the kitchen, and then he pulled out this scrapbook and showed me all these pictures from his early days of clippings and, and that's what happened. I mean, but it's not like you can't afford either to be indignant. How dare you address me like that, my good man? It's like, no, I mean, I hope that he wasn't going to, commit some kind of violence on me. But I didn't. I felt like, okay, I just have to say why I'm here, who I am. I wasn't impervious to fear. I mean, I was like, but nonetheless, I mean, the whole point was, he said, "What are you doing here?" And I told him. And
Well, I think that you've answered what the real beauty of your writing is that you don't probe people to get something out of them. You have a conversation and you follow these threads that maybe nobody else would have thought to follow. And then there opens up this understanding and this view of this person that's from a prism through a prism that hasn't been written about before. That's really the beauty of it, Peter. I mean, it moves me deeply to hear you talk about this and to read your writing.
thanks.
I would encourage everybody to get this book, by the way. I'll read one more question.
Okay.
ZK, there's not a full name here. Mr. Guralnick, please share with us the 3 or 4 musicians who you were most pleased to champion and why.
I couldn't do that. I mean, I can't be pleased to champion anyone. I mean, if I were to say I was thrilled to write about Stoney Edwards, probably 99% of the people out there wouldn't know who Stoney Edwards was. And I don't think Stoney Edwards' recorded music lived up in any way to his originality as a person or potentially as a musician. But nonetheless, he was such an extraordinary person. And it was, in writing about whether you're writing about, Elvis Presley or Dick Curless, a country singer from Maine, who, again, not that many people know about. I mean, I'm sure there are a good number, but not as many.
Yeah.
You're writing about the same kind of impulses. You're writing, and it isn't measured by commercial success, nor is it defined by lack of commercial success. I mean, you can't say because somebody didn't make it, they're better than somebody who is, extraordinarily popular. I mean, each person is so strikingly individual, and many of the people I've written about, I've become friendly with over the years. Some people like Charlie Rich or Solomon Burke or Sleepy LaBeef, or ultimately Sam Phillips, who told me about 15 years after I first met him, he says, my son Knox, he fell in love with you the minute he first met you, but I didn't. and he hadn't up till that time. And, we became friends, but I'm just saying the friendships were of enormous moment to me. But I mean, the fact that I wasn't friendly with Tammy Wynette. I wasn't friendly, but I met her, I interviewed her. I tried to immerse myself as much as I possibly could in her story. And it meant a great deal to me to write to her. Her music doesn't mean as much to me as Merle Haggard's. I mean, I have to confess that. I mean, I really admire it, but it's not the same. For me, it was never the same thing, but her story and herself were just as, so that's why I can't rank it. I can't say one is more valuable than the other, or
I get that. I mean, it's like judging a person's work by the last thing they did. No, it's the whole breadth of it. Okay, so we'll end this. Someone writes, Christopher Colligan, that the anxiety and the fear in these times are heightened by the lack of live music, and what do we do? And I think that's true for all of us, but our passion for it is not reduced in the slightest.
Mhm.
And right now you have to find things online. I mean, it's going to be slow, but I do think it'll come back. And until then, you can read Peter Guralnick and enjoy it vicariously, right?
Or listen to your new single.
Or listen to my new single, watch it on YouTube or something. Thank you, Peter, so much. It's such an honor and a pleasure to speak with you.
No, thank you. I really enjoyed it. Thanks so much.
And thanks to Politics and Prose.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. I do want to say Peter's book, there's so many, we just kind of scraped the surface. There is so much powerful and very powerful profiles in there. I'll just mention Ray Charles, Chuck Berry, Howlin' Wolf, Bill Monroe, Joe Tex, Delbert McClinton. He says great chapters on Doc Pomus and Lieber and Stoller. Willie Dixon, Alan Toussaint, and Elvis Costello collaborating. So I just had so many. You convey the feeling, and I thank you, Peter, and I urge anyone and everyone to buy the book. Don't forget the last 30 pages. Peter does a fantastic job of recommending music and books, videos, articles about all these artists. It's very personal. It's very heartfelt. I think that initial love and excitement that he felt has always been there. Mm-hmm. And it really comes through. And I urge everyone to click in the chat page. Please buy the book. We do at the end of each session just ask our guests if they recommend a book or a piece of music. I mean, but anything that struck you or that you've read recently, would love to recommend. Just Peter and
I'll
Rosanne.
go quickly.
Yeah.
I'll go quickly. Because of Peter, I'm reading Lee Smith, Fair and Tender Ladies, and it's just mind-blowingly great. Right. And through the pandemic, I've been listening to a lot of Sam Cooke, because I think in times like this that are feel so catastrophic and we're not grounded to anything, that you pick something timeless to listen to, and it is soothing and it makes you feel like things are going to be okay.
And Peter?
Well, I could second each of those, but I'll throw in Jess Walter's new novel, The Cold Millions, which is just such an astonishing book. It takes place, I think, in 1907, maybe, roughly around that time. And it's so contemporary, it's so pertinent to today's problems. And one hopes I haven't finished the book yet, but hopefully to today's solutions. But he's just an incredible writer who every one of his books is different, sort of like Lee. But each one of his books is different. But this, to me, is almost a pinnacle of his work, which is a pinnacle of, of our age.
That's great. We'll include those, I think, when we put this up on the website. I also do a weekly music recommendations on our website, which is politics-prose.com/music. I really want to thank Peter Guralnick for, a lifetime of work, and the same for Rosanne Cash. Thank you so much. Thank you for a great conversation. And I'm going to just dig, as Rosanne said, go down all of these rabbit holes because there's so many of them. And just connect this great music with our history and our times. And there's so much there. So thank you very much.
Thank
And
you.
have a safe night and a good new year. We hope for some changes around here. Speaking of changes going to come,
Yeah,
we hope
there you go.
there's going to be some changes in DC. So on that note, thank you again and
Thank
good
you.
night.
Good
Thank-
night.